to introduce Malia Odekirk now. Malia is our second presenter. She is a second-year master's student at Lamont and is pursuing a degree in musicology with an emphasis in ethnomusicology. She's also a teaching assistant for music theory and oral skills and is completing a certificate in music theory pedagogy. Outside her time spent at Lamont, she teaches percussion to a variety of students and deeply enjoys both research and education. Malia will be speaking to us today on the topic of WGI adapting to COVID, and she will unpack some of the initials there. So I'd like to ask everybody to join me in welcoming Malia Odekirk.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to our presentations today. I know both Sophie and I have been really excited to present. And hopefully everyone can see my screen. All right. So my project today is covering Winter Guard International and its adaptations to the COVID-19 crisis. COVID-19 disrupted the whole world, and this disruption severely affected Winter Guard International. While students and activity members usually met and rehearsed with vigor, their season instead came to an abrupt halt in the spring of 2020, and all members had to deal with a lack of closure and unfinished musical products that would likely never again surface. In 2021, they were met with radio silence and question marks about beginning again. Staffs of WGI groups around the country found themselves adapting to constantly shifting regulations from the CDC and local governmental ordinances. These shifting sands made planning and creating a musical product similar to the normative expectations of the activity incredibly difficult. As directors like Keenan Evans of the Blue Knights Percussion Ensemble have made clear, these difficulties produced more questions than answers, and in many cases, delayed the start of the season for members significantly. As restrictions diminished, groups began to rethink an activity that has never been performed for a strictly virtual audience. The decisions which ensued led to incredible creativity and unique performances which integrated tradition and groundbreaking uses of multimedia, community engagement, and creative settings. Groups around the country preserved the music making and meaning of WGI while adapting to the only opportunities they were afforded. As a result, Winter Guard International will survive and continue to grow as a dynamic entity and community that gives students around the country and even the world a place to call home. For the purposes of this project, I've limited my scope to percussion groups competing in the WGI category entitled Independent World. This group includes mostly college-age students who are akin to professionals in the activity. Most audience members and students know and look forward to watching these groups because of their high caliber performances and the intricate and exciting theatrical design that goes into the shows they create. Although the activity includes color guard, percussion, and wind instruments with skills ranging from novice to semi-professional, independent world percussion groups are often characterized as representing WGI as a whole and recur frequently in discussions of the activity. So for the brevity of this project, they seem a fitting way to approach the unique innovations occurring due to COVID-19. By analyzing videos and personal and online interactions from several groups, I will elaborate upon the innovations and adaptations which occurred in response to COVID-19. I look at groups from a representative sample in the Independent World category who continued operations this year, including Atlanta Quest, Blue Knights Percussion Ensemble, George Mason University Indoor Drumline, Monarch Independent, Redline Percussion, and Strike Percussion. Videos from these groups and discussion with individuals helped enlighten the adaptations which occurred and the processes behind choices which were made to foster success in a year unlike any other. Winter Guard International, or WGI, began 44 years ago in 1977. At the time, the activity sought to extend the opportunities provided by Drum Corps International for color guard members in the off-season of performing, so members could continue honing their skills and compete year-round. Following the growing success of the activity, WGI began a percussion circuit in 1993 and a winds division in 2015. These branches of the activity have allowed members to specialize and compete during the winter and spring and continue capitalizing on camaraderie, musicianship, and theatrical performances throughout the year. Although no minimum age requirement is specified, members are usually in their high school to college aged years and cannot exceed the age of 22 in normal participating seasons. In normal seasons, competitions are held in high school gyms and performance arenas around the United States primarily. Various local competitive circuits have formed to create microcosms of WGI in specific areas and allow more schools to participate in the activity. Groups who are able then travel to Dayton, Ohio for the yearly national championships held across 3 universities in the area. Performing members and staff alike look forward to the unique community which comes together at this national championship. Previous to COVID-19, WGI gave students and educators a place to work together tirelessly every weekend. Groups often rented or borrowed space in high schools around the country to rehearse. These organizations spent upwards of 24 hours each weekend working to perfect their theatrical shows and build foundational skills to become better musicians, marchers and dancers, and performers. Following a few months of these grueling weekends, groups would take to the competitive stage, or floor, as WGI typically terms the performing arenas, and fight to be on top with groups in their local communities. After COVID-19 occurred, students not only lost the end of their 2020 competitive season, but their hopes of a normal 2021 season were also dashed. When WGI announced a fully virtual competitive platform for the 2021 season, percussion independent world groups became uniquely creative in their approaches to building a show and season. Instead of rehearsing and competing in high school gymnasiums and concert arenas around the United States, groups became creative in their settings, or at least in the ways they used them. They also had to include a much higher caliber of media recording, something that took quick adaptation and often outsourcing for many. Groups also wrestled with providing meaningful experiences for their current membership and finding ways to recruit for future years so the activity could continue to flourish instead of withering into oblivion. The 2021 virtual season opened the floor to many groups for creative thinking and increased community interaction. Although many regulations hindered specific types of interaction for a time, WGI groups thought outside the box to connect with artists and musicians outside their normal spheres. The most prominent examples of these interactions come from Atlanta Quest and George Mason University Indoor Drumline. Atlanta Quest began their online video production with this statement, quote, "In Atlanta, diversity runs deep. It extends into all aspects of our life, especially our music. Without the possibility of a traditional season, Atlanta Quest invited our friends and family from the Atlanta Drum Academy for a special project to represent and share in our love for the drum," end quote. This statement outlines the group's community-based intentions to increase their interaction with diverse community members. WGI traditionally has many members who identify as white, although the diversity of membership often echoes the communities the groups operate primarily in. This statement undoubtedly echoes nationwide concerns following the BLM movement's major uptake last June. In order to bring this statement into action, Atlanta Quest collaborated with the Atlanta Drum Academy to produce a video that included performances from groups within both organizations and a collaborative performance between all members in the final minutes of the video. This first video showcases Atlanta Quest's original group. This next features the youngest group of the Atlanta Drum Academy. Next, we have an intermediate group, likely teenaged. Finally, from the Atlanta Drum Academy, we have the elite group. And finally, the collaboration between Atlanta Quest and Atlanta Drum Academy, a truly impressive mass of drums in one room. While Atlanta Quest collaborated with a large group, George Mason University Indoor Drumline, or GMU as they frequently term themselves, and I will also call them for sake of time, collaborates with a single member named Joseph Noah to create a visual album that mixes rap and WGI style percussion music. The layers of style create a unique product, and although GMU previously explored this collaboration in their 2019 production, the opportunities and style of collaboration changed dramatically with this digital sphere, including setting changes, media clips, and digital layering of musical and visual characteristics. As GMU states, quote, "George Mason University Indoor Drumline's 2021 visual EP entitled Close to the Sun explores a new genre of entertainment, one that combines marching percussion with pop culture. While musicians and performers used to have the opportunity to fly high in the thrill of live performance, the past year has taught us that the closer we fly to the sun, the farther we fall back to earth," end quote. Joseph Noah had more autonomy and artistic freedom with the collaboration of producers and mixers who integrated musical sounds and ensured that his voice came across as desired through the short album.
Something like your parents just treat you with neglect. Block him out my house, I can't normally catch him sleeping. ZCC for the speaking feces. Speed through beat, I'm BP beeping. Y'all just fame, y'all get too greedy. Obtaining it so easy, difficult part is trying to keep it. Honey, I think I struck the kids cause they just getting oh so teeny. Pop a wheelie, this is silly, I'm too chilly. She got bets that I make a milli. They don't bet that I flex on many, y'all a pity. This that ditty, sounding gritty, duck and shimmy. I'm on net with a flick my wristy, check on deck when I'm all like Miss.
Most groups dramatically increased their theatricality through visual stimulation and effects. Many groups used striking and unique imagery in their performances, which revolved heavily around low lighting, colored lights, often placed at strategic and exciting angles, such as underneath the instruments or players for effect, and other fabricated effects like pure darkness or smoke and fog, which proved especially effective in situations of dramatic lighting. Both these effects have not been allowed into WGI arenas for safety reasons, but create vibrant and stimulating visual productions that aid the viewer in experiencing the music richly. Strike percussion creates a play on eliminating WGI's limitations, starting with the name of their production, When No One's in the Room. As Strike states in the description of their video, quote, Strike used 2021 to reflect on past shows, overcome the pressure of these trying times, and look to the future. We highlighted some of our fan favorite moments as if they were a dream. We then will highlight the pressure to perform at a high level, even through the tough times we are all going through. We end with the release of that pressure and celebrate what's to come, end quote. This statement helps to unveil their connection between tradition and eschewing the restrictions of WGI. Their musical production echoes this by beginning with the lights off, something normally impossible in the WGI arena. The group soon brings low lighting into the production and draws in recorded elements of announcements and judges' commentary from past seasons. The group then goes on to use multicam angles from GoPro cameras, dramatic color changes in the lighting, and further use of total darkness.
What's up? Good evening, Strike Percussion. Hey, Strike Percussion. Tonight I'll be adjudicating you the caption of effect music. Judging music. Judging vision here tonight.
Redline Percussion also stood out as a group that found ways to connect their lighting and effects to the imagery their theme evoked. Drawing from the Glass Animals' recent album Dreamland, Redline echoed the colors of the band's album art and used this vibrant low lighting to create a fantastical and dreamlike effect. The colored lighting also separated the imagined aspects of the storyline from the realistic aspects of the dream. As seen with Redline Percussion, some groups used their rehearsal areas to the fullest extent. Hallways, gymnasiums, stairways, and videos shot outside of rehearsal spaces altogether found their way into Redline's production and storyline, some of which we didn't get to see. Other groups took approaches that came as their rehearsal spaces allowed. In an interview conducted on May 11th, 2021, Keenan Evans expressed that the Blue Knights Percussion Ensemble intended to connect COVID's insistence on adaptation, and this included the group's unique setting for performance. Blue Knights used a circular space located on the Arapahoe County Fairgrounds. The space allowed for consistency and boundaries that could be used and also broken. The group created a show called Be Water that illuminated the necessity to adapt through quotes, musical choices, and movements they created within the outdoor circular space and beyond the confines of this small area on the Fairgrounds campus. Members used the different levels of concrete to step up a level, created formations that mastered and matched the circular space, and went in and out of the boundaries of the space in camera's view.
Be formless, shapeless, like water. If you put water into a cup, it becomes the cup. If you put water into a bottle, it becomes the bottle. You put water into a teapot.
Here we could see them moving both outside the confines of that space and within it. Monarch Independent takes a similar approach to Redline in introducing their concept. The settings change frequently and revolve around the members in their own comfortable home environments, which echoes the name of their show, Bring It Home. A creative conglomeration of sounds from individuals performing seemingly menial tasks in their home became percussive and led to the in-person outdoor production Monarch Independent created as an ensemble. The group forged several separate individuals as they were previously isolated in COVID into snapshots that eventually merged into the collective. This use of multiple settings helped echo the sentiments that although they may have been home alone previously, they had a sense of truly coming home when they came together again as a group. Although their outdoor setting is less than remarkable, a large and well-groomed open field, they make use of the space as a way to retain freedom and safe interaction between the members. Here we can see the whole group operating together. Although these groups may have to eschew some of the effects and adaptations they chose for their 2021 productions to accord with WGI rules, the choices they made will have lasting impact. Community interactions will help recruit new members and make the activity more visible and accessible to audiences. The increased marketing and social media interaction, coupled with better digital productions, will help to legitimize the music making and theatrical performances these groups compete with in the future. The added effects may not make their way into the WGI arena for safety reasons, but groups may continue to think outside the box in how they produce videos and create engaging online content for fans. Instead of WGI being limited to gymnasiums and arenas around the United States, bolstered by iPhones recording lot performances, media experts may continue to produce high-quality videos of these groups. Their potential to create, connect, and impress has only begun because of the innovation of designers, staff members, and students around the country. Thank you so much for your time. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask.
Thank you, Malia, for that report on how that community has negotiated the COVID era. I'd like to invite anybody who has a question or comment for Malia Odekirk to go ahead and unmute yourself and just address her directly.
I don't know if anyone else is going to go, but I have a question. Who's surprised? So Malia, I wonder, since you've been talking recently about the labor practices of teachers as well within the marching arts, how do you think this transition to incorporating all of these new video design projects and using all of these additional features changed the role of the educators in this situation? I know it's been a bit of a transition for students, but what kind of experience do you think that was as an educator as well?
That's a great question. It's actually something I've been thinking a lot about, and I think it varies from group to group, really. A lot of that has to do with the resources that are already in play. So In many cases, some of that work could be outsourced, as I sort of alluded to earlier in the presentation. Many groups were bringing in media experts, companies who are doing digital productions already, and were able to do great work without a lot of extra training. In the cases that wasn't available for money reasons, time reasons, networking reasons, the onus really became on the educators, which was difficult. And even so, there is the very honest reality that it has to come from somewhere, even when it's outsourced. So paying for those sorts of services was required from often the memberships fees or, fundraising opportunities through the groups. Those are things that are grappled with every year. And we see that members are having to pay higher fees as inflation happens in the country and demands of production are already increasing, because the theatricality requires a lot to put into that, both the design music-wise, the design visually, buying props, buying costumes, and actually making sure the instruments are in play and the maintenance of those instruments is upkept, since the music is the primary intention of those groups. So those issues are occurring, always, regardless of the digital sphere that's kind of like really blown up in the COVID scene, for lack of a better way to put it. But I think that it really just varied group to group, and a lot of instructors were putting in extra time or expected to have different skill sets that they were drawing upon for this.
I guess as a follow-up, if no one minds, do you think that that's gonna, create these gaps when they go back to performing in person? Is that some students will have had these experiences to have great performance times over COVID, whereas schools that don't have the funding or the skills will have missed out? Is that going to create a void in the competition when you go back in person?
That's a really good question, and one that I think we're going to have to sort of wait out and see. It's a little bit tough to tell, because one of the unique aspects of this performance venue online was we saw groups just kind of like growing and doing much better than they've been able to in the past few years. Like Redline is a great example of that. That group has sort of been in the back of the pack of the independent world percussion group for many years. They've been kind of getting in the last 5 placements, I would say, for a few years. And it's pretty clear that the video they created and the quality of content, as well as musicality, there's a lot of technical things that are happening there for percussion that are really high quality. So there's this possibility that some groups will be able to grow from that, and then maybe some groups will lose out from not having taken those opportunities. But to that degree, it's really hard to tell without having actually seen them in competition, which won't happen until February through April this year. I know that some groups were fighting to just encourage individuals to keep pursuing music on their own and practicing, even though they didn't have their own groups. And honestly, I think the younger the age group, the more that those issues will come to play. The more adult semi-professional groups, like the ones I just showcased, will probably be a little bit more congruent with how they were operating and scoring in the past. I think the younger groups will really, that will be where it's tough and a lot of mobility happens.
So I have a question for Malia, if I may. I'd just like to just step back a little bit and ask you what made you want to look into this? What made you want to do your research on this area?
Yeah, that's also a great question. Honestly, a lot of what I wanted to look at was why these groups aren't being studied in the first place. That's what brought me into this. There is just a paucity of research in this area, and a lot of it has to do with stigmatization or like a misunderstanding of what the activity entails and who's performing in it. So it's something that I was already interested in sort of bringing into the conversation of musicology and research, but I just thought this was a great venue to do that, to get started, because I just realized there were so many unique adaptations, and also it gives the opportunity to present with like a great multimedia approach. Like all of these video examples allow me to bring literal performances of these groups into the conversation instead of just discussion of it.
So I've thought a lot over the last year or so about how a lot of composers adapted to the economic circumstances in Europe after the First World War, and how Stravinsky went from writing these humongous ballets for these huge orchestras to pieces like Histoire de Soldat, where you just needed like 7 people to play it. And I wondered, if adaptations like that were going to happen during COVID that would have ramifications down the road. Do you think that there's a connection here? Like, do you think that this will change the course of things to come?
It's a distinctive possibility. We're already seeing some of that in the scene right now. In Colorado, for example, we have the group that I talked about, Blue Knights Percussion Ensemble. They have a larger membership this year than they did last year, which is positive in that sense that they're bringing in more students who are able to perform in the activity. They're bringing in more funding. But on the other side of that coin, there's another group in Colorado called Rise Percussion, who in maybe a couple of years ago, 2 or 3, had started their own open group. So like just a less qualified classification, I guess, or students who are more intermediate than advanced. And that group has had to what we call fold or not be able to perform this year because they haven't been able to bring in enough members, haven't had the right funding, all of the above. So unfortunately, we're seeing sort of both in some areas. Like there's another group I know called Broken City Percussion. They're probably bringing in more students than they had in the last year based on some photos I've seen online and discussions I've had with people who are in the group. But it really just varies from place to place and the resources and recruitment that people were able to do. So I think it's similar in that sense, but for these groups to operate, you still have to have a certain baseline number of members because the cost is pretty excessive for the travel, for the production. So I think in that sense, you're not going to have the same sort of adaptation musically that you might have had, with Stravinsky, where you're having a lot less membership just because it would not outweigh the costs of traveling and creating this theatrical production in general.
You did mention that certain groups that had been, eclipsed kind of at the back of the pack earlier were able to, surge forward in a different environment. And a question that I was thinking of asking you was whether these conditions and these dynamics had the potential to, and I don't know what, power relations are like within the groups, but if they had the potential to disrupt or transform hierarchies within groups. But what you said in response to Sophie's question made it seem like maybe the hierarchies or the structures that exist between groups are going through some transition. Would you say that's true?
It certainly seems possible. And I think, again, as I said with Sophie, it'll be really fascinating to see what happens when these groups actually go head to head again, because that has not occurred yet. They're in the sort of beginning stages of their seasons right now, where they're putting the show together. Most of them have just done auditions and gained their membership, which changes every year. So it'll be hard to tell until those groups are going head to head. But I do think there's a distinct possibility that it might occur based on some of what I saw, like seeing groups that were bringing a really quality musical product and visual product to the table. I have a feeling that a lot of them will gain membership from that, which is a huge part of creating like a chance for competition. If you have a quality membership, you have a lot of people who are invested in it and working really hard, that tends to create a better production overall, which gives them a better chance in competition. So there's always going to be political difficulties with that. I think in any field that's the case, in any musical competition that's the case, but I do think there's more possibility for mobility for some of those groups who have been struggling for a while, and that's a lot of those groups' hopes as well.
And at the risk of dominating the discussion too much, I have one more question. You mentioned that you felt like this is a really understudied area, and there wasn't a lot of, it sounded like you didn't find a lot of literature that already existed. And I had actually gotten the impression in the past that that was at least partly because of the competitive nature of the activity, that groups kind of have trade secrets that they hold close and don't want to share too much. Do you think that that's true?
I certainly think that's true to a degree. I think there's a mix of issues with the paucity in literature. Part of it is the way that academia views this activity in general. I think there's been maybe for some reasons like rightful and for some reasons absolutely unfair treatment of the activity, in the sense that musicians who perform as concert musicians as well as in this activity, the demands and the technical approaches are very different. And so teachers in the academy have tended to dislike the activity for that reason. And a lot of those sort of stigmas against the activity and its technical approaches and the way that it affects musicians playing have sort of leaked into literature as well, or like why people don't want to talk about it. But to what you're saying, I think there's a possibility in that, especially in more serious areas. The activity has had a lot of issues with diversity, with harassment and misconduct in the past. And I think some of those issues are actually what tends to make people not want to talk in the activity. A lot of that is changing now. Some of those issues are really they're being brought into the light of day. They're being attacked. They're being, dismantled, which is great. It's still a big work in progress, but I do think that is maybe one of the bigger issues that's caused people to be afraid to talk about the activity in cases that like some issues within their own organizations might come to light, or mistakes they've made in the past might come to light and change, who funds them, who wants to support them, how they are viewed, and that sort of thing.
That's interesting. Well, I'll be
So
quiet
what are
now.
the what are the biggest misunderstandings? So you mentioned like part of the reason this isn't studied is because there are big misunderstandings about what this actually is. And so I'm a little clearer, like what are the biggest misunderstandings that you think?
Yeah, well, one of the things that is a big conversation between like people teaching like professional musicians or training professional musicians and teachers in this activity is that like the techniques that are used are so different, and sort of the tonality of how you play, like say if you're a brass player, maybe the tone quality that you're looking for, the dynamics that you're looking for, and the demands on your body are different. I can't obviously speak as much to brass as I can to percussion, but the same is true in percussion. Like you're often expected to play louder, you're expected to play harsher in some situations, and just expecting different actual technical approaches to the instrument. So a lot of those conversations have led into this, well, that affects musicians so much that they can't get the best quality out of their concert education. And that's been the conversation. I think a lot of that has shifted over time, which is why I think it's a misunderstanding, but it's an imperfect issue as well. Like certainly there are truths in that statement. I think now a lot more educators in the marching arts are trying to keep in mind how to make better musicians who aren't doing really harsh, damaging things to their bodies. But it's still an imperfect issue. And that is what's led to a lot of these conversations and like the stigmatization for actual performers in the academy. I think that maybe has trickled down into the discussions about it as well. But, that's something I'm not entirely sure about.
I mean, when I hear this, I just think this actually, I also think this falls betwixt and between multiple disciplines, music education, musicology, ethno. If you like, you could take multiple approaches to this study, right? That would fall into multiple disciplines. And I almost feel like that might be part of the reason why. In addition to, I feel like the martial, we don't write a lot about marching bands. We don't write a lot about kind of the martial history of music. Although that's becoming more like music and violence is becoming totally a thing that people write about a ton. But I don't know, right? But I just spitballing here.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. The intersection of disciplines can make it really difficult. And honestly, I don't know if I have something super concrete about that, but I've just had some conversations with future possible advisors or other professors in the field saying like, this is a body of work that I've considered talking about and heard like, well, you need to make something really interesting or forward thinking about it, or I'm basically just going to throw away your application. So, those conversations make me question, like, obviously I don't know exactly why that's happening, but there are some deeper seated reasons that that's the conversation. However, I feel like there are some really engaging issues at play that are fascinating to talk about. And it's just a musical venue that I think is wanting to be talked about more because it bridges so many different fascinating things like musical characteristics and visual aid and the like theatricality of a storyline in many cases or a concept. It's just like, it's something that could be really rich in discussion if possible.
I think you need to do some more brainstorming about why this is so compelling, right? Like, because yeah, it's like you got to convince people to be curious.
That's a great point.
And that's something we should discuss more.
I think the two of you should go out to lunch.
I like that.
Malia, you showed us a few clips. I wonder if you have links that you could share to those performances that if we were interested in watching the whole thing, we could
Absolutely.
follow
Thanks for the reminder. Here they are.
in the chat. Thank you so much.
The first one is also more about the activity in general, in case anyone is like, what the heck is this? I'd like to know more.
Any more comments or questions?
Oh,
for
also,
Malia?
this doesn't really fall into community music making either, but it kind of does. That's the other betwixt and between.
That's true. I could see the participational aspects of it, although it's more of a presentational form. And there is a huge community of people who really buy into it and talk about it. So even if that's not actually music making participation, I think there is like a lot to be said about the community that's involved and how they buy into it.
Is there sort of a fandom around it?
Oh yeah, for better or for worse sometimes. A lot of that too has to do with like alumni, people who have already been a part of it. Maybe somebody who gets drawn into the community, although I think that's more rare. Oftentimes it's kind of a self-perpetuating group of people who are supporting it as well. Maybe in the same way that like we were talking about with Sophie's issue and the money, like where the money comes from makes it kind of stay within house. I think a lot of times this is similar with membership. The people who have invested their time, energy, and money into it tend to keep wanting to do so in some way or are interested in it. Although that's not exclusively true. Some people, do it and then are done with it.
Well, also we're talking about institutional reproduction in both of these talks, right? Like the ways these institutions are structured, the way people are rewarded and promoted, they're structured in order to reproduce themselves. That's the whole point. I mean, it's how universities work too, maybe. But it's a very interesting thing about how can you structure something to foster innovation. How can you structure something to foster something other than what it's been fostering thus far?
Outside its comfort zone. Right.
Yeah, and I think maybe a lot of ethnomusicologists might not be interested in this because it appears to be like a white male dominated martial kind of thing, and like a lot of ethnomusicologists are trying to move away from that. Unless you're talking about white nationalism, which is very sexy. So so convincing them that they're mistaken and that there is something that's valuable to society that we need to talk about here, I think is really where we need to go next.
Yeah, I think there's a compelling argument to be made. So I'd love to talk more about that.
Any other questions or comments for Malia?
Hey, Malia. Thanks for your presentation. I don't really have a question per se, but I just wanted to comment again on the fact that this subject to, I think mainly just to quote unquote serious musicians is something that like, it's one of these things that seems like pretty shallow on the surface. And then you realize there's so many angles, like Alasia said before, that you can kind of approach this subject from.
Right.
Like I had a lot, so just a little bit of background. My father was the assistant band director for Clark College, which is now Clark Atlanta University, which is like a totally kind of different universe of, marching band. And, I'm from Atlanta. I grew up, and I remember when I first discovered that there were these things that were other than marching bands that were not associated to a football game. And then I found out like I was in a youth orchestra. I was one of the few non-white people in the youth orchestra. And so the marching arts, which is a term I only found out about recently, were largely white, and I was just like, and I wasn't sure if it was I'm sure it was a location thing, but I think the competitions also themselves were largely white, and it just kind of seemed like another universe. And there seems like there has to be some shared history there. And I was just like, while you were talking, kind of just rattling my brain, like, why is there this sort of like radically similar, these similar things going on that have nothing, on the surface to do with each other. And then I also remember growing up around marching band, and even at, the young age of, I don't know, 9, 10, 11, 12, wondering like what the end game was is like one of the most pragmatic thoughts I had in my childhood. Like what is the end game? And I think, I don't know how long the competitional marching arts have been around, but it seems like, whereas when we were talking about Sophie's presentation, the barbershop society is there to sort of preserve this thing. It made me wonder, was this field created just because there was a vacuum and then people wanted to do, what they were doing in college that didn't have this professional end to it? Or at least as far as, I could tell. Anyways, I'm rambling now, but like, I just wanted to say this presentation really opened up a lot of lines of thought for me. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your thoughts. I feel like I'll try to keep it quick, but I actually do have a little bit on the history. It's something that I want to look more into, and I can't say that I'm an expert in, but I really feel like part of the issue and diversity stems from the military backgrounds of marching band. There was a lot of characteristics that developed in marching band from military bands or janissary bands that were created in wartime. And so a lot of those characteristics have stayed, and I think they tend to be very racialized characteristics, which is not necessarily right or fair, but the tendency toward precision and like exact movement together, both in musical playing and in the physical movement of their bodies, tends to be a racialized idea. So like, what I mean by that is you're talking about the difference in bands, like the one that I think you said your dad was a director of. A lot of the Southern style marching bands, they are a little bit more free with their movement, with the way that they play music. Some of it is more oriented toward like the jazz influences in, let's say, like New Orleans, and a lot of the bands like that are moving and just focusing more on entertainment and like making a musical product than a really precise product. And that's obviously a generalization, but I think some of those, like the way that the activity is diverged has to do with that. And like the issues in racialization tend to be conflated with musical characteristics or movement characteristics and the expectations on performers. So you might have someone who comes from a marching band that's a Southern style band trying to compete against other auditioning members who are very familiar with this tradition that is asking for a different kind of precision or a different style of playing. So in that way, as we were just talking about, it's self-perpetuating, and it's certainly a problem.
Yeah, oh, sorry to interrupt.
No, please.
No, I just wanted to back up to your comments about how the sort of professional music world looks at this art form. I think there's a racial divide there too, also because of the type of music that they're playing. I think it's less so now in the classical sort of, quote unquote legit music world, because there's the internet and we can all see how like crazy good a lot of these ensembles are. But growing up, you're right, the music that they were playing at my father's school was almost directly related to the culture and jazz influenced music. And so it was like the things that they were doing on the field and the things that they would have been doing on stage were essentially kind of the same and equally as impressive, whereas it's night and day in most cases what you'll see in the marching arts and what you'll see being taught at Lamont or any sort of like conservatory.
Right, and to that issue as well, I've noticed that there it's just a dislike in the stylistic changes that occur because of the art form. So that makes it also difficult for people to support it, because there's been a lot of appropriation of art music into the marching arts. So, you know, you'll see groups who are playing very common classical pieces, like, you know, Scheherazade, for example, or Dvorak. You know, there's just a lot of taking that music and recreating it in this art form, and many times it's really disliked because of the characteristic changes that are happening or the way that it's played out with the theatricality. So a lot of that also creates contention within, you know, conversations about its value. But one of the things that I've noticed is a lot of the value that members get from it is just in the communities that they create, and they really buy into those. In many cases, they gain a lot personally from it and musically from it, even if it doesn't directly apply to the exact ways that they're playing. Like they might gain work ethic, practice, you know, skills, or just like technical abilities that they then have to translate into a more concert-oriented approach. So it's kind of difficult, because I do see the merit in some of the conversations that are happening against the art form, but I also feel like they need to be modified at this point. And I do think we really, really need to work on the diversity initiatives within the activity. It's something that I've been talking to the community about a lot, and it's just a difficult issue that's going to take time to fix, as we're seeing all over the world, unfortunately, especially America.
But when we want to change the culture of a group, we're also talking about, you necessarily need to change the structure of an organization, right? Which is basically what Sophie was arguing.
Yep.
But I think this is like, you're really getting at some really interesting issues of value here, Malia. Also the movement stuff. I was so hoping we could talk about that more, because the different styles of movement is fascinating. And also, like, maybe it's not about the exact performance, even though obviously performance is important. Maybe it's also about like process and community, and all of this stuff is kind of combining.
Yeah, absolutely.
Also,
I think there's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, and like, we should be talking more about masculinity and ethnomusicology.
Yes.
Like, why not?
I agree. I think one of the interesting things as well is that there are initiatives that are working toward helping, you know, talk about that in this activity in particular. There's one initiative called In Step that's trying to, it's mostly focused on DCI or Drum Corps International, but it's trying to bring women into the conversation, focus on how like women are doing well in the activity and are sort of breaking down the structures of hierarchy. So that those conversations are happening. They're not fixing all of the problems immediately, as they never do. Like you mentioned, it's structural, but I think it would be very pertinent to like relate those issues in both marching arts and, you know, ethnomusicology or the field.
No way, Juliet, I'm shocked. Sorry.
Basically, anywhere there's only instruments, you're gonna have a masculinity problem, it seems.
So I'm just
Masculinity isn't only a problem, like.
No,
Right,
I mean,
yeah.
a boys' club problem
There you go.
is what I mean.
Yeah.
So this is not my area of expertise either, but it's my impression that these different forms, marching band, drum corps, Dixieland jazz, the concert wind ensemble, all have common roots in the military band, particularly of the Civil War era. Can anybody speak to that? Does anybody know more about that than I do?
I mean, the military band tradition has become so international. It's a very, very widespread tradition. So I don't know specifically about Malia. Malia can speak to her, you know, this. I don't know about American history. I mean, why would I? But like, you can find these military band traditions all over the world, and they've really very much influenced like music in West Africa. You know, a lot of the times this is where those brass instruments, this is why people got a hold of brass instruments in the early 20th century in, say, West Africa. It was one of the reasons why, right? In addition to there are other things. It's a convergence of multiple things, but I think we often underestimate kind of how important these military traditions are.
I've been told that there was a large surplus production of band instruments during the Civil War era, and after the Civil War, that they were utilized. They were repurposed in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, I hadn't heard that. That's so cool, Woody. Thanks. Maybe David knows more about brass instrument history. I don't know.
Sorry, more about brass instruments doing what?
Just the boom of popularity of brass instruments after the Civil War.
The idea that there was a surplus of brass instruments floating around after the Civil War, after the armies were demobilized, and people found uses for them.
Right, that would make sense. I don't know anything about that though. So.
I don't know if I can speak to the history of the instruments themselves so much, but one thing I found interesting is even the costumes, or I guess they're kind of called uniforms / costumes now, have developed out of those military traditions as well. Like you used to see the really big headpieces, and then they kind of developed into like plumed shakos, or what they're called. And then now that's changing a lot because there's a move toward, like, I guess just the theatricality, like costumes fitting into that tradition in all areas of marching arts when people can afford it, which is another whole other issue. But it's been fascinating to see how even like the smallest aspects of what people are doing, like what they're wearing, which has become a bigger aspect, still had developed out of that military tradition.
It's quite interesting because the brass band tradition in the UK is really massive, especially in Northern England and some places in Scotland. So, but there's a lot less theatricality involved with it. So it's quite interesting to see those differences, because the brass band tradition is so huge and the military bands are massive in the UK too, but in a very different way. It's all very reserved and refined. I guess there's a lot of relation to the royalty and how you're involved with that, I guess.
Would you say that there's the same, like the kind of stigma that Malia was talking about, that a similar, reticence in the academy, in the conservatory exists towards brass band music and that kind of musical practice?
No, I think in the UK it's actually quite popular, and you actually find that brass players in the UK are like desperate to get into those kind of brass bands, because that's where you have the most opportunity to perform. In my experience with my friends who played brass instruments, obviously I can't speak to it personally, but certainly in the Northeast where I went to university, it was like the brass bands were a big prize, and being part of that was very important. But yeah, not as theatrical, not as fun, but definitely part of the mainstream culture, and was encouraged to go for by professors.
This is kind of a conversation that I can't speak exactly to the British tradition because I don't know as much about it as you do, Sophie, but I feel like regardless, this whole activity just bleeds with colonialist structure, unfortunately. And that's part of the issue that causes these diversity, like lines, and like thinking about precision, for example, or the expectation that like everything is perfectly together. And that's a huge aspect of how, people are judged, or how these performances are judged, or even in your case, like less theatricality. I would say in some cases less entertainment based, like considering the band styles that we were talking about before. A lot of that has to do with like those structures that are in place of organization and like perfection. And a lot of those are colonialist narratives that have just kind of like seeped into all these different musical activities. Like obviously it's a big part of Western music as well. Less so than like participatory music traditions, where precision and togetherness is it's superseded by community and like the interactions that are happening there.
Also, like theatricality and visuals are often seen as kind of like not as valuable, right? Like distracting from selling out, commercialism, all this stuff that plays into how we see, how we value, how we think about value in music making.
I think it's that elitism of understanding too. Like the more that we add multimedia experiences or the aid of like something that increases entertainment or understanding, there's that sort of idea that like, oh, people who really understand this art form or this music form or whatever don't need extra stuff. And so it's that elitism that's kind of embedded within that practice as well.
Now I want to know what all the other musicologists you talked to about graduate school had to say to you, but that's another conversation. I do have to go, but I want to thank you two for really interesting, thought-provoking, well-organized and well-presented papers.
I'd like to echo that. Thanks. Thank you very much to Sophie Lewis and Malia Odekirk for sharing your work with us today. So there are a few people here who are not at Lamont and did not get the announcement of the colloquium. I want to put my email address into the chat. And once the video is prepared and posted online, if you would like to get a link to that, please feel free to just let me know by email that you'd like to know about that. And if there's anybody who would like to be, I've decided, because Antonia sort of made me realize this, that there are people outside of Lamont. There may be more people outside of Lamont who are interested in attending these colloquia. If anybody, I'm going to start developing a non-Lamont mailing list for this. So if anybody would like to be on that mailing list, anybody who might be looking at graduating soon, or who may have recently graduated and wouldn't be getting Lamont internal emails, but would like to know about these things, please feel free to let me know. And I will make sure that you are in the loop in the future. So there's my email address. It's been wonderful to see everybody. And look forward to seeing you all next quarter, I hope. Bye-bye now.